Well, welcome back. I didn't know if anyone would come back after yesterday. You're a brave group. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, I'm talking about sex today. If you have children, you might want to think about taking them to the children's division because some of us would rather expose our kids to those ideas later on in life. Leave that to your judgment, but that is your PG, sort of warning like the television, I suppose. It's interesting, isn't it? We are constantly bombarded with messages that life is getting better. And in some ways, those messages have veracity. Let's just take, for example, in the area of world poverty. There are about 1 billion people who've been lifted out of poverty, extreme poverty, over the last 10 years or so. That is a very, very big achievement. Of course, because world population is growing so quickly, there's actually more people living in extreme poverty today than there were, but the percentage is lower. Does that make sense? Okay, you're with me. And there are a lot of other things that are improving. The lifespan of people around the globe is going up, and of course, we all have more stuff, particularly gadgets. My kids have seen the ad for this Apple Watch. You heard about the Apple Watch? Now they've stopped bugging me about getting them an iPhone, and now they're bugging me about getting an Apple Watch. I told them, these still work, They're clever people, those guys at Apple. They know how to give us something that we don't need and get us to pay for it. But nonetheless, very interesting. We have all these gadgets. We have longer life. We have a lot of good things. A lot of people lifted out of poverty. Some people would look at all that and say, we are headed towards the utopian ideal that we long dreamed of. But there's another side to the news. Particularly in Western nations, the news is very, very mixed. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the United States. The U.S. is struggling. It's lost its economic leadership. And just 5 months ago, it lost its position as the largest economy in the world. Now, just to give you some perspective about what a seismic shift this is, from the time Ulysses S. Grant was president of the United States, you remember him? He was a general in the Civil War. That's how old and long ago this all is. We're talking about horses and carts and all that stuff. From the time that he was president all the way up to December 2014, the United States of America was the number one economy on earth. Friends, welcome to the new world. The U.S. is now number 2. But the news is worse than that for the U.S. Through greed encrusted in political and economic systems, and through the growing family dysfunction that Americans are experiencing, the middle class in the U.S. has shrunk dramatically, and the chasm between the poor and the rich has become a gaping hole. As we saw yesterday, the crime rate for children from broken homes is roughly 300% higher than children from intact families. And of American children born in the last 2 decades, now about 50% of the white kids or the Caucasian kids are going to at some point live in a home where one of their biological parents is not present, and about 75% of the African American children will live in a household without their biological father at some point during their childhood. Well, we shouldn't be surprised that with familial dysfunction has come a high crime rate. In fact, today the United States has more people in prison than any other nation on earth. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, of course, the United States is a big country. It's going to have more people in prison than a country like Australia. Sure, fair enough. But it even has more people in prison than China. And China has 4.25 times as many people as the United States. Well, of course, in China, out-of-wedlock births remain uncommon. Indeed, until 1997, having sex outside of marriage was actually criminalized. I'm not suggesting that that's the way to go, but what I am saying is that China's rise and America's fall can directly, in part, be shown to be related to the relative strengths of their families. Drug abuse is rife in the U.S., violence is epidemic. The U.S. murder rate is almost 412% that of China. And that's despite locking up so many people, or maybe in part as a result. I read something that really kind of shocked me, and that is that 5 out of every 100 Americans has been convicted of a felony. A felony is a serious crime. When you think about that, if you got a group of Americans together and you said just a random selection from 0 to 100 years old, 5 of those 100 will have been convicted of a serious crime. And as we know, only a small percentage of those who engage in serious crimes are actually apprehended and convicted. And some of the most heinous crimes, like rape, for example, often go unreported and unprosecuted. So it could well be that far higher than 5% of the population have actually engaged in a felony. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it is even higher. Family dysfunction and economic policies designed to make the rich richer and the poor poorer have resulted in a perverse fiscal situation. The U.S. is at the point where only 1 in 2 Americans today pays federal income tax. 1 in 2. So 50% of the population is paying 100% of the federal bill. It's not because the U.S. is a nation of tax dodgers. It's because a very large percent of Americans are so poor their income does not qualify them to the point where they reach the threshold where you have to pay federal income tax. If the familial breakdown, crime, and economic problems are not enough, the U.S. is facing an escalating mental health crisis. In 1998, Martin Seligman, who was the president of the American Psychological Association, spoke at the National Press Club about the American depression epidemic. And I want you to listen very carefully to this. We discovered 2 astonishing things about the rate of depression across the century. This is the rate of depression in America over 100 years. The first was that there is now between 10 and 20 times as much of it as there was 50 years ago. So depression has gone up by 1,000 to 2,000% over 5 decades. And the second is that it has become a young person's problem. When I first started working in depression 30 years ago, the average age of which the first onset of depression occurred was 29 years old. Now the average age is between 14 and 15 years old. So what he's saying is, we are seeing in real terms a dramatic increase in the number of our population who are suffering from depression. Now, like you, I assume, I don't see depression as a spiritual failing or anything along those lines. Christ himself said he was, the Bible says, was a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. It's okay to be sorry. It's okay to be grief-stricken, and it's okay to be depressed. That is not, I know as children we were told we were happy if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands and all that. Jesus wasn't happy all the time. Why should Christians be happy all the time? I'm not talking about this as a spiritual failure. What I am talking about is a societal failure. Something in society has gone very, very wrong. Are you with me? When you see that kind of increase. Imagine what that's doing to the strength of the United States. It is sapping the very foundation of the country, and it's costing the nation a huge amount. Severe disabling mental illness has dramatically increased in the United States. And I got this from Slate magazine, which is not certainly not a conservative or Christian sort of outlet, but it's an interesting statistic, and I want you to listen to this. The tally of those who are so disabled by mental illness that they qualify for supplemental security income or Social Security disability insurance. In other words, government benefits because you are so disabled by crippling mental illness that you can't work. The number of Americans who are qualifying from that went from 1 American in every 184 down to 1 in 76, more than halved between 1987 and 2007. For children, the rise is even more startling, a 35-fold increase in mental disorders that disable them in the same 2 decades, a 35-fold increase. Something is very wrong at the heart of Western society. Western civilization that once seemed so strong and unshakable is today shaking on the edge. Tragically, in both the United States and Australia, youth suicide rates tripled between the 1950s and the 1990s. We're told that life is getting better and things are becoming wonderful. We have gadgets, we've got wealth, we have this great society, but something at our heart has gone wrong. All is not well. It's true the US economy is stumbling into a half-baked recovery, but that is built upon immense government borrowing. How much government borrowing? Think about this for a minute. Today, there is $18 trillion of American government, federal government debt. There's also debt at the state and local levels, but I'll leave that aside. 18 trillion. Now, most of us don't count in trillions, so that's very hard for us to imagine, isn't it? So, what percentage of if I was going to pay my salary, my entire salary in to pay off this debt, how many years? Forget it. It'll just take you. Don't worry about it. Don't do the math. It'll just make your mind, your head explode. This is a way to think about it. The amount of debt per American taxpayer is now $154,000. So imagine a baby is born today. Welcome. $154,000 in debt, and guess what? It's growing at a really, really rapid pace. Despite this, despite the growth, the GFC reminded us just how fragile we are and how vulnerable our position as far as debtors can make us. Europe is similarly in an economic and social malaise. A beautiful place to visit, no doubt. I'd highly recommend it. Go and enjoy it. Come back and be thankful you don't live there. Youth unemployment in a place like in Spain is now 50%. You imagine that. You graduate from high school or college, your chances of getting a job is 1 in 2. Italy is also struggling. Greece, of course, is in a crisis of almost unimaginable proportions. But even France and Britain are under enormous pressure. I had somebody say to me, don't worry about Greece because, the Germans will bail them out. I said, well, what about Italy? Yeah, don't worry, the Germans will bail them out. What about Spain? Don't worry, the Germans will bail them out. But then I went and looked it up. Did you know that the Italian and the Spanish economies combined is almost as big as the German economy? In total, the Germans can't bail them out, right? Even if they wanted to. And as far as I can tell from reading the press, the Germans are not particularly inclined. As the mining boom subsides, even the healthy economy in Australia is sliding downwards. And like the US and the UK, all of our progress has left us more unhappy, and even more tragically, as previously noted, more of our young are choosing to end their own lives. We're constantly told we're doing well, we're not. We're constantly told we're making great progress, not on the most important things we aren't. Over and over again, we're told that life is better now than it was in the past. Well, maybe it is in some areas, no doubt, but certainly not in all. Our mental health is suffering, our economic health is suffering, Western civilization is losing relative economic power, its vital core, and its global leadership. We were told that violating God's rules when it came to sexual behavior would usher in an era of unparalleled pleasure, of progress, and of happiness. We're entering into the age of Aquarius and all those things. Andrew Kingston will remember what I'm talking about. You remember that? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. Some of you who are younger will just ignore me. You have no idea what I'm talking about. You'll have to look it up on Wikipedia. We were told that all these great things would happen, and yesterday we looked at some of the statements about how throwing off the shackles of sexual repression and all these things are going to lead to great self-fulfillment and growth. But instead, what we've reaped is unimaginable suffering, social breakdown, economic weakness, and psychological trauma. Today, of course, the front lines of the sexual revolution are in the area of homosexuality. This is the next frontier of the sexual revolution, and its impact is profound. Once again, we're being told that the Christian view of sexuality is not only wrong, but is dangerously wrong. You don't have to go far to find attacks on Christians, but at least Christians who believe in the sexual morality described in the Bible. One site I looked at yesterday was a Facebook page that's called, quote, Christian Bigotry Kills. Do you know why young people are ending their lives? It's because of Christians, and particularly Christian views on sexuality. The fact that as the church has waned, youth suicide has gone up threefold seems to be completely ignored. You don't have to go. I read this recently, and this happens. These sort of statements are being made in respectable news outlets. This is something that I read in the Huffington Post, and it was an article about the bigotry among Christians. It said, quote, if you preach against gay rights, you are a bigot. If you write against gay rights, you are a bigot. If you give your money or time to any Christian church or ministry that you know actively works to restrict or limit gay rights in any way, you are a bigot. If in private you intimate to your dearest friend that you don't think gay people should be allowed to get married, you are a bigot. Of course, if that's true, it has profound consequences in society and consequences in the law. You wouldn't want, for example, someone who is a bigot working in a government job, would you? Of course not. And as we'll see, Christians who have spoken about homosexuality have been fired from government jobs in the United States. And you wouldn't want to permit private groups who are bigoted to access government funding, would you? And what about businesses that set themselves up in a manner that is bigoted? We'll look at all of that in a few minutes. But first, let's look at what the Bible says about homosexuality, and then whether it is, in fact, God's view, and whether, in fact, God's view of sexuality is indeed wrong, dangerous, harmful, and bigoted. Well, there are a number of texts in the Bible that talk about sexual behavior that's appropriate and inappropriate. I'll just read a couple of them. One is found in Romans chapter 1, so that's in verse 24. Now, I should say yesterday I looked at texts that talked about adultery, that talked about looking at pornography or looking at women lustfully. We looked at stuff about sex before marriage, and there is nothing that we are talking about today that is any way distinct from those issues. The truth is that all of us have fallen and come short of the glory of God, and all of us have temptations, and I certainly do, and I'm going to make the assumption, though I don't want to hear about the details, that you do too. This is what Romans 1 said. Therefore God gave them over to sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged the natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men. They not only continued to do these things, but also approve of those who practice them. Another place in the New Testament where this is discussed directly is 1 Corinthians 6:9. And this is an interesting text because it includes a wide variety of problems, and some of them, my assumption is, are problems that some of us here have. And it could be that there are people who have all of these, because we're all sinners and we all have issues. Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Don't be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy. I think we got a way to go, Pastor Slade. Where are you? It sort of hits home, doesn't it? Nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And that is what some of you were. It's a beautiful text. That's what some of you were. That's some of the people he's writing to. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. It's a beautiful thing. But make no mistake about it, the Bible is clear on this issue. Although there are some who've tried to sort of work their way around it. One thing that you learn in law school is not only how to manipulate words, but how to see and identify when other people are trying to do so. And whenever I see theologians try to wiggle around these texts, they use the same kind of tricks that lawyers use, and it's obvious as the nose on your face what's going on. Anyway, so are those who believe what the Bible has to say ignorant hate mongers? Are those who oppose redefining marriage to include same-sex relationships bigots? Well, one enters the fray of same-sex marriage debate with trepidation. The principal parties of the debate are so polarized that the stakes seemingly so high that anyone game enough to express an opinion has best be prepared to bear the brunt of brutal attacks, not merely on his philosophical, theological, or legal position, but on his character. Somebody said to me yesterday, you're a brave man to talk about all those things yesterday. Talking about all that stuff's easy. Today, it takes some bravery. That's the reality. It is therefore worth to clearly say at the outset what I am and what I'm not focusing on this morning. I'm not going to talk generally about the rights of homosexuals. Indeed, many of those who oppose redefining marriage to include same-sex relationships are in favor of protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in the secular workplace, and are in favor of the robust enforcement of laws against those who perpetrate hate crimes against the gay community. That's certainly my position. I'll never forget, as a teenager, one of my cousins was gay, and I got to know him, obviously his partner, and they were out in Sydney one night, and a bunch of what they used to call gay bashers chased them down and bashed them up. Well, friends, that's not the way to have a society. That's not right. That's not good. That's horrible. And of course, people who do that kind of stuff should be prosecuted, and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. What I'm talking about is not whether legislators can redefine marriage. Clearly, they have the power to do that, at least in a secular realm. Further, it's not about stigmatizing or alienating gay, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual human beings, any more than my talk yesterday was about stigmatizing those who struggle with other sexual sins. By now, most of us realize that we have family members or friends who are gay. And my roommate from Andrews University, my first year of college, I went to Andrews, came out of the closet some years ago. And he and I have traveled in Asia, we've traveled in Israel. This summer we plan to do a road trip from Detroit to New York City, despite the fact that we view life and faith differently. we still are very good friends, and I still love him as a friend very dearly. Similarly with my cousins. Think about the gay people that you know in your life or your family, and I hope and I believe that for most of us, you have similarly warm, loving, kind, gracious feelings. So this isn't about that, and what I'm going to talk about is about whether same-sex relationships should be recategorized as marriage or not, and whether those who believe same-sex sexual activity is immoral should be systematically marginalized, stigmatized, and ultimately whether we should face legal punishment. There are a variety of reasons the state has an interest in marriage, but the one I'm going to focus on today is that marriage is the principal way through which children are created. Even in America, after 4 decades of a sexual revolution, still about 2/3 of children are born into families, are born to married couples. That's down from approximately 95% in the 1950s, but it's still the norm despite all the change. That society has a compelling interest in the birth and nurture of children is obvious on its face. Who will care for us when we're old? Who will continue our civilization? Who will protect our nation? Who will maintain our infrastructure? And remember that national debt? Who's going to pay that off? It will be the little babies of today. At least they may not pay off the debt, but at least they'll service it. There are few, if any, more pressing interests a society has in providing the ideal environment for children to grow up in. But it turns out marriage is not only the principal arrangement through which Americans have children, and virtually every other society, but it's also the best way of raising children. We'll get into that in a minute. That only reinforces society's interest in the institution of marriage. In addition to protecting and nurturing children, marriage provides a vital stabilizing force for adults, particularly young men, and provides a remarkably strong economic unit. In short, the state has every reason to take an interest in the institution and its vital role within a healthy society. Are you with me? You know what I'm saying? This is important. Some activists have stated that same-sex families are no different than heterosexual families. This claim is problematic on its face. Of course they're different. That's obvious. The question is not whether they're different, but whether they are different in a way that justifies treating them differently in our legal code. I believe there is solid evidence that the best environment for children is a unified family in which the mother and the father stay together. For example, an Australian study compared the academic performance of children from 3 types of households: children living with married parents, children living with an unmarried heterosexual couple, and children living with a homosexual couple. The study found that children from married households outperformed children from unmarried heterosexual households, and that children from both forms of heterosexual households outperform the children living in homosexual households. Now, I know that there's other studies that show something different. We'll get into that in a minute. Similarly, a recent study found that teenagers living with their 2 biological parents have significantly improved mental health and academic achievement, and significantly lower rates of serious behavioral problems at school compared to teenagers living in single-parent households or blended families. This study was sponsored by the Urban Institute. Now, that's an entity, a think tank in the US, which has published material in favor of same-sex marriage. But at the end of this study, frankly concluded that, quote, the most favorable outcome we observed for teenagers are for the teenagers living with their biological parents who are married to each other. Are you shocked? Well, maybe you're not shocked, but there you go. The American Psychological Association's Review of General Psychology recently published an article that concludes that there's overwhelming evidence that the love of mothers and the love of fathers differ in significant ways, and that the receipt of both kinds of love is very beneficial for children. I don't know if you've experienced that growing up, but I certainly did, and I think my children do too. Just yesterday, as we were driving to the airport, I said to my kids, "What is it that you appreciate about Mummy?" And I got all these, things that my kids appreciate about Lisa. And then Lisa turned around and said to them, "What do you appreciate about Dad?" Now, they were an equal set, but they were quite different sorts of things, if you know what I mean. Quite different. Finally, there's evidence that children experience the lowest rates of abuse when they live with their mum and dad. All these studies, and many like them, point to the rather unremarkable conclusion that kids do best when they live with their mum and dad. Advocates of same-sex marriage often point out that there are many families that are deeply dysfunctional or even abusive, and that, of course, is true. There's nothing new to those of us who have worked for decades and have been decrying the breakdown of the family. Even during this time of almost unimaginable instability in families in Western countries, however, the mum and dad family still outperforms all others. It's time for society to do all it can to preserve, protect, and advance, rather than taking further steps down the tragic path to family disintegration and normalizing and approving of family arrangements and encouraging, I should say, family arrangements that are not as beneficial to children. It's worth noting that just because there is an overwhelming evidence that, as a rule, children do best when raised with their mum and dad, this does not mean that there is universal agreement on this matter. In fact, some professional associations have adopted positions stating that there is no distinction between parenting arrangements and the environment for children. These positions resemble statements of faith informed by political ideology rather than informed positions based on the reality children face. The same kinds of statements of faith by professional organizations preceded the divorce revolution in Western society. And yesterday we looked at the impact that revolution is having on young people. This is ideology at its worst. Blind faith in an orthodoxy that ultimately results in harm to children. In recent years, children of gay parents have begun speaking out about what they missed. I want to read a couple of the statements from children who have spoken out. One is Heather Barwick, and this is what she had to say recently. Growing up, and even in my 20s, I supported and advocated for gay marriage. It's only with some time and distance from my childhood that I'm able to reflect on my experience and recognize the long-term consequences that same-sex parenting had on me. A lot of your kids are hurting. My father's absence created a huge hole in me, and I ached every day for a dad. I love my mom's partner, but another mom could never have replaced the father that I lost. I grew up surrounded by women who said they didn't need or want a man. Yet, as a little girl, I so desperately wanted a daddy. Katie Foist, who serves on the academic and testimonial councils of the International Children's Rights Institute, has also spoken up. She recently wrote a very touching letter. It's a little bit long, and I haven't included all of it, but I think it's worth hearing from people who've been through this and have something to say. Before we take the guts out of marriage and throw this whole thing and change it completely, I think it's worth asking what this impact is going to have on the kids who are going to live with those impacts. This is what Katie had to say. She says, "It's very difficult to speak about this subject because I love my mom. Most of us children with gay parents do. We also love their partners. You don't hear much of us because, as far as the media is concerned, it's impossible that we could both love our gay parents and oppose gay marriage." The same thing that I read to you from the Huffington Post. You are either a bigot or you support gay marriage. That's the black and white that's being put out there. What she's saying is, and you'll see, it's possible to love the gay members of your family. It's possible to love gay people, gay Americans or Australians, but not necessarily believe that marriage should be fundamentally altered. You don't hear from much from us, as far as the media is concerned. It's impossible that we could both love our gay parents and oppose gay marriage. Many of us are of the opinion many of them are of the opinion that I should not exist. But I do, and I'm not the only one. This debate at its core is about one thing. It's about children. Children are the reason government has any stake in this discussion at all. At bottom, civil society has an interest in maintaining and protecting the institution of heterosexual marriage because it has a deep and abiding interest in encouraging responsible procreation and child rearing. Simply put, government has an interest in marriage because it has an interest in children. There's no difference between the value and worth of heterosexual and homosexual persons. We all deserve equal protections and opportunity in academia, housing, employment, and medical care, because we're all humans created in the image of God. However, when it comes to procreation and child rearing, same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples are wholly unequal and should be treated differently for the sake of the children. When two adults who cannot procreate want to raise children together, where do those babies come from? Each child is conceived by a mother and a father to whom that child has a natural right. When a child is placed in a same-sex headed household, she will miss out on at least one critical parental relationship and a vital dual-gender influence. The nature of adults' unions guarantees this. Whether by adoption, divorce, or third-party reproduction, the adults in this scenario satisfy their heart's desire while the child bears the significant cost, missing out on one or more of her biological parents. Making policy that intentionally deprives children of their fundamental rights is something that we should not endorse, incentivize, or promote. I identify with the instinct of children to be protective of their gay parent. In fact, I've done it myself. I remember how many times I repeated my speech. I'm so happy with my parents got divorced so that I could know all of you wonderful women. I quaffed the praise and I savored the accolades. The women of my mother's circle swooned at my maturity and my worldliness. I said it over and over, and with every refrain, my performance improved. It was what all the adults in my life wanted to hear. I could have been the public service announcement for gay parenting. I cringe when I look at it now because it was a lie. My parents' divorce has been the most traumatic event in my 38 years. While I love my mother's partner and friends, I would have traded every one of them to have my mom and dad loving me under the same roof. This should come as no surprise to anyone who's willing to remove the politically correct lens that we all seem to have that's covering our eyes. Kids want their mother and father to love them and to love each other. I have no bitterness towards either of my parents. On the contrary, I'm grateful for the close relationship with them both and for the role they play in my children's life. But loving my parents and looking critically at the impact of family breakdown are not mutually exclusive. You understand what she's saying? You don't have to choose one or the other. You can love people and also talk about policy. Now that I'm a parent, I see clearly the beautiful differences my husband and I bring to our family. I see the wholeness and health that my children receive because they have both of their parents living and loving with them. I see how important the role of their father is and how irreplaceable I am as their mother. We play complementary roles in their lives, and neither of us is disposable. Neither parent is disposable. In fact, we are both critical. It's almost as if Mother Nature got this whole reproduction thing exactly right. I'm not saying that being a same-sex attracted person makes one incapable of parenting. My mother was an exceptional parent, and much of what I do as a mother is a reflection on how she loved and nurtured me. This is about the missing parent. Talk to any child with gay parents, especially those old enough to reflect on their experience. If you ask a child raised by a lesbian couple if they love their two mums, you'll probably get a resounding yes. Ask about their father, and you are in for either painful silence, a confession of gut-wrenching longing, or the recognition that they have a father that they wish they could see more often. The one thing that you will not hear is indifference. We are made to know and to be known both our parents. When one is absent, the absent leaves a lifelong, gaping wound. The opposition will clamor on about studies where research has concluded that children in same-sex households allegedly fared, quote, even better than those from intact biological homes. Leave aside the methodological problems with such studies and just think about that for a moment. It is undisputed social science that children suffer greatly when they are abandoned by their biological parents, when their parents divorce, or when they are donor conceived. Then if that is agreed, and it is in social science, then how can it be possible that they are miraculously turned out even better when they're raised by same-sex headed households? Every child raised by two moms or two dads comes to that household via one of these four traumatic methods. Does being raised under the rainbow miraculously wipe out all the negative effects and pain surrounding the loss and daily deprivation or one or both of your parents? The more likely explanation is that researchers are feeling the same pressures as the rest of us to prove that we love our gay friends. Redefining marriage redefines parenthood. It moves us well beyond our live and let live philosophy into a land where our society promotes a family structure where children will always suffer loss. It will be our policy, stamped and sealed by the most powerful of government institutions, that these children will have their right to be known and loved by their mother and or father stripped away from them in every instance. In same-sex headed households, the desires of the adults trump the rights of the child. Have we really arrived at a time when we are considering institutionalizing the stripping of a child's natural rights to a mother and father in order to validate the emotions of adults? I know that's quite a long letter and contains a lot of information, but I think it elegantly explains the dilemma that we face as a society. Society has a most compelling interest in the birth and nurture of children. Children do best when they live with their mom and dad. Therefore, society has a compelling interest to promote families in which moms and dads live together and raise their children. This is accomplished by recognizing and promoting the uniquely beneficial nature of the male-female marriage. Before I close, I want to give you a perspective on what is likely to come down the line for us. Because I've talked quite theoretically. I do believe that in Australia, like in New Zealand and in many states in the United States, we will redefine marriage. And that redefinition is going to have a profound impact on not only on children, as we talked about, but also on Christians and Christian institutions. So I'll just talk very briefly about that. When people start calling Christians who believe in the Bible's view of marriage bigots, there are consequences to that belief. And we are starting to see those ramifications gain speed. In the U.S., there have been a couple very high-profile exits of public officials. One was Dr. Walsh, who was an Adventist, who's a public health director in the city of Pasadena, California. He went for a job as the public health director in the state of Georgia because of sermons where he's talked about the sort of things that I'm talking about this morning. He was targeted by gay rights activists. His job was subsequently withdrawn, and he became persona non grata. Similarly, there's the fire chief of Atlanta. I don't know why these are coming out of Georgia so much, but there you go. Was also fired for writing an inspirational book where he tangentially touched on sexual morality, where he said that the only sex inside of a heterosexual marriage is acceptable to God, and he similarly lost his position. That has resulted in a lawsuit. We'll see where that goes. And there's another story that's come out of the West Coast in the U.S. of a florist. And this florist refused to provide flowers for a same-sex marriage ceremony. I think because they've put together quite a good video of this, I'm going to show that now. But before I do, I just want to say, you're going to see these kinds of stories reported in particular ways. The Christian is always a hardline bigot. They hate, people. They're unreasonable and a very, very sort of unlovely, horrible sort of way. What I want you to do is take a few minutes, watch this video, and at the end of it, ask yourself, is this the kind of person that is constantly, does she fit the caricature that you hear over and over again? Or is this just somebody who has a faith commitment, is trying to do her best to balance that faith commitment with her life, and does she deserve to be pursued by the state, both personally and professionally? Let's have a look at that.
This is my treasure. I have one for Brenton and New Haven, Missouri, and Edison, Pennsylvania, Birmingham, Alabama. This one is from Sri Lanka, India, and it was a minister who was on a train who met an American who had an article about Arlene's flowers. He calls every week and just says, "How are you doing, sister?" And then I got the Bible from a church in Yakima that came down, and they came to the shop and just said they were behind us and that they were thinking of us, and very, very special. You just want to do something out of the ordinary, something that tickles somebody's fancy or makes them smile or whatever. You just get these ideas in your head, and you really can't describe them. You know, I don't have a theory about it or anything. I just do it. Well, I think most artistic people, you know, especially painters, I think, they put their heart into their arrangements. It's part of them. It's part of who they are. And I think that's the same thing with a florist. The joy of being here so long is to get to know people personally. I don't consider the people that walk in the door customers. They're just people that want something to please somebody else, and that's my job.
She is the most kind, gentlest soul you'll ever meet. If you go into her shop, you're going to get a hug. And so she's very warm. And she had established a really warm relationship with Rob Ingersoll, who had been in 9 years and would come in and spend a good amount of money throughout the year. And they had gotten to know each other pretty well.
He has a very creative mind, and so we just sort of hit it off.
At one point, he decided to get married a few months after same-sex marriage became legal in Washington State. And he, of course, wanted her to do it.
There was a real struggle to decide what to do with that. My husband and I talked it over, and, you know, as much as I love Rob, I just couldn't be a part of that. If I did Rob's wedding, it would be from my heart, because I think he's a really special person, and I would want to make it really special for him. So it wasn't something that I flippantly said, "Oh, I'm not going to do Rob's wedding because he's gay." When I talked to Rob, I did not think this would be a major issue. I was very surprised at that.
The Attorney General's action in this case is unprecedented in Washington State. We have never had an Attorney General take the position that this Attorney General is taking. Now the ACLU's piled on, and the same-sex couple have sued her as well. And interestingly, they have sued her in her personal capacity as well as her business. So she is at great risk. As a result of serving someone lovingly and admittedly in a kind way for 9 years, and because you won't do one same-sex wedding, you're going to lose your house or your business. And she's been working in this business for 40 years. I've read a lot of hate mail over the years, but what I've read in this case just is stunning. It makes you sick to your stomach when just volumes after volumes, thousands of pages.
People are filled with hate and refuse to even listen to what the real story is and how angry and frustrated, and it's just so sad.
This is about marriage. It's not about bigotry. She knew of their relationship. She provided flowers that they sent to each other. But when it came to marriage, that was the line. Because as she'll tell you, marriage represents the relationship of Christ and his church. It's a sacred covenant.
Marriage is a sacred, very sacred thing. You want flowers for your anniversary, your birthday, or whatever, that's fine. But I just cannot do a same-sex marriage.
So this case in particular is coercing someone to engage in expression, and that's against America's tradition, and it's unconstitutional. It's also unnecessary. There are lots of florists. If you look in the Tri-Cities area, there's like 3 pages in the yellow pages of florists that could have served this couple. They've even admitted that after they received enough offers for free wedding arrangements to do 20 different weddings. But yet, what's being set up here is that's not good enough. It's not good enough that there are other florists. We have to coerce everyone to do what we want them to do, even if it violates religious convictions.
I have to have faith that he's going to protect me and give me the courage and the knowledge and the wisdom to stand firm on this. But it's also helped me understand what obedience is and what I'm going to cry and what following Christ is. You know, you can't sit on the fence like he says. You can't be lukewarm. And that's what I was. I was lukewarm. Baronelle, God bless you, sister. We are all praying for you. Stand with you 100%, Pastor Tony. God will hold your hand no matter what. God bless Opal. I will certainly continue to pray for you and thank you for your commitment. Lord bless Dan Greer. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. God bless you, Cheryl Sampson. Rest in Jesus, you're a daughter of the King. That one got me. May God's strength be with you, praying for you, Dave and family. Hope all goes well. Just remember God loves you. Dirty Casper.
Well, according to the Huffington Post, she is a bigot. According to the state of Washington, she should be prosecuted. If you don't think that can happen in other Western countries, I think you are very mistaken. I have a few things to finish off. I think that going forward is we're going to face some very profound issues. I personally don't think that Christians who support the unique benefits of marriage between men and women are bigots. I don't think that they should be punished. In fact, I think that there is plenty of anti-Christian bigotry at work in our community, and that bigotry is growing. We are going to find ourselves faced with a number of very difficult decisions in the future in many Western countries. I hope not here, but I think likely so. State funding will likely be made dependent at some point on changing our position on sexuality. Hiring criteria will be impacted. For some of us, we will be effectively barred from a variety of employment opportunities, just like has already happened in the state of Georgia. I don't think that in the near term we'll be incarcerated or anything like that, but advocates are already advocating for the state to use every means possible to marginalize and to stigmatize Christians who believe in marriage as defined in the Bible. And my closing question to you this morning is this: what will you do? You heard what the florist had to say. I was lukewarm, and this has sort of pushed her. Are you willing to give up what you have to remain true to the Bible? What are you willing to be called to remain true to the Bible? How uncomfortable are you willing to be made to feel, and how much of an insult are you willing to take? How much economic price are you willing to incur? These are all good things to ask ourselves right now, because this is the trend in Western societies. Because if the answer is that Christianity isn't worth sacrificing a comfortable middle-class life for, probably now is a good time to bail. Because we're on a trajectory where it is going to become increasingly uncomfortable to be a Christian, or at least a Christian who actually believes in the Bible. And that's okay, because discomfort and genuine Christianity have a habit of going hand in hand throughout history and around our world. My challenge to you is to remain faithful, to remain true, and to remain strong, but to do so in a way that is full of God's love, grace, and of course, humility. We're all sinners. We've all fallen. We're all condemned by the law. Only through God's grace do any of us have a chance at eternal life. Let's be strong, but let's be loving. Let's be principled, but let's be graceful. Let's be firm, but let's be humble. Let us all aim to be the women and men who, as Ellen White put it, will not be bought and sold, who in their innermost souls are true and honest, people who do not fear to call sin by its right name, people whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle is to the pole, who will stand for the right though the heavens fall. Why? Because in Western nations, we are starting to see the heavens fall all around us. Now is the time to decide to be strong. Let me just say a prayer. Dear Lord, you know that we have talked about difficult and complex ideas this morning, controversial ideas that are increasingly unacceptable in Western society, and indeed ideas that have increasingly become a cause for regulation and stigmatization. Lord, if I've covered these in an insensitive or inarticulate manner, please cover that. If there are those among us who are struggling with this particular issue, please bless them and come close to them. You know that each one of us is suffering and struggling with sin, and most of us have a weakness in one way or another in the area of sexual temptation. Lord, please help us to be humble, and may that humility be obvious. Lord, please help us to be loving, and may our love reflect your undying love for humanity, and may all of us be graceful, both in the way we live and the way we treat each other. We thank you so much for loving and caring for us, Lord, and we ask for your presence to go with us from this meeting. Amen.